This video details the installation of a Slo-mo into a roundhouse billy. The Slo-mo is a mechanical device which adds inertia and momentum to small steam locomotives to give them more realistic running. It's made up of a flywheel, a gear train to a input-output shaft, and then a miniature chain drive which will engage on a sprocket which will fit to the back axle later in the installation. On each side of the Slo-mo there are 3 O-rings sitting in pockets that have been machined into the side plate. Make sure the O-rings are seated in these pockets. Also 2 threaded holes. These 2 holes will take the bolts that will hold on the clamp plates to secure the Slo-mo into the billy locomotive. These clamp plates use the slots that come standard in the chassis frames, so there's no cutting, drilling or filing to finish this installation. The Slo-mo for the billy comes with a cover. Of the kits we've developed for different locomotives, the billy is the only one that has a cover. That's because the boiler on Roundhouse Billy sits well above the frames, so the Slo-mo is easily seen between the boiler and the frames, so we've put a cover on it just to make it less obvious. This is the sprocket that needs to be fitted to the rear axle. It needs to be in the chain before you start the installation. When you're installing it into the chain, the hub on the large sprocket needs to be on the same side of the chain as the hub on the small sprocket in the Slo-mo. When installing in the roundhouse billy, I like to remove the valve dome and the sanding box. Take out the small brass screw and remove the sanding lever. Then undo the tapped brass cap and take off the sanding box. I like to do the install on these with the loco completely upside down. I just use a couple of paper towels. If you fold them a couple of times and then roll them, they'll make the locomotive quite stable to work on. Now that the locomotive is upside down, the first thing I do is remove the spreader bar between the frames. And with the locomotive still upside down, I remove the main cranks. Once that screw is out, we need to remove the crank from the axle. I use a screwdriver to lever the crank off. I lever from one side, then the other, and I alternate. Make these movements small or you will deform the squared hole in the crank. And I like to lever against the wheel and not against the frame. And now we repeat that on the other side of the loco. With the locomotive upside down, I've removed the spacer bar, taken the screws from both sides of the rear axle and removed the cranks from both sides of the rear axle. This locomotive has always been gauged to 45mm and the rear axle is in very good condition. Not all engines are like this. If they've been re-gauged a number of times, there's scratches and burrs on this axle that makes it very difficult to carry out the next procedure. If there are marks on the axle, I usually get a bit of 400 and holding the wheel still, give it a bit of a wipe. And repeat that until the axle looks fairly clear of marks or scratches. I'm not trying to remove indents from the axle, only burrs and scratch marks that stand above the surface. If you rub this too much, you'll reduce the axle diameter, so the wheels and or sprocket won't be a snug fit on the axle. I'll undo the grub screw on the right hand wheel, and with a twisting moment, move that wheel to one side. Nip the grub screw back lightly. And loosen the grub screw on the left hand wheel. Let the Slo-mo sit between the frames. Fit the sprocket to the axle. When you're placing the Slo-mo in between the frames, this section has to go in front of the expansion link bush, and with the loco upside down has to go under the front wheels. And re-enter the axle into the axle bushes. Nip the grub screws up very lightly. We will have to re-gauge the wheels properly later on. Now that I have the sprocket on the rear axle and the Slo-mo sitting loosely between the frames, I'm going to fit the clamp plates that will hold the Slo-mo in place in the chassis. 2 plates per side. The clamp that fastens the front of the Slo-mo has a single hole, and the clamp plate that goes to the rear of the Slo-mo has a slot. That lets us move the Slo-mo to correctly tension the chain. The front clamp with the hole, we'll put a bolt through which will pick up the front tapped hole in the Slo-mo. The clamp plate with the slot, we'll put a bolt through, and that bolt will pick up the tapped hole at the rear of the Slo-mo. The front clamp has a boss machined on it. That boss will engage in the standard slot that comes in the Roundhouse chassis to hold the Slo-mo in place. When the clamp's fitted, the straight side or the long side of that boss needs to be vertical, and the side of the plate adjacent to the boss should face the rear of the loco. Set that in place and just make sure it's free moving and properly engaged in the slot. Pull the Slo-mo forward. And we need to start that bolt in the threaded hole. Sometimes these will just fall in, and sometimes this is the trickiest part of the install. Once that bolt's started, just 1 or 2 turns, then make sure the boss is fitted properly into the slot, and then wind it the rest of the way in, but we don't want that tight yet. The rear clamp, which has the slot in it, again has a boss machined in the back of it to engage in the slot in the chassis. When it's in place, the slot needs to be horizontal, and the slot covers only about half the length of the plate. The slot needs to face forward in the locomotive. Put that in place. I find it helps to pull the Slo-mo forward as far as it'll go at this point. Fit one of the socket head bolts supplied with the kit into the slot, and then again we need to get that bolt to engage in the threaded hole in the Slo-mo. Again, a couple of turns, make sure it's nicely sitting in the slot, and then wind it the rest of the way. We don't want that tight yet until we put the 2 clamps on the other side. While I have the loco in this position, I'll replace the main crank onto the rear axle. Using the front crank as a guide, hold the back crank in the same orientation and turn the axle until the square on the axle locates into the square in the crank. Replace the screw. And of course, once we have the 2 clamp plates installed on the other side, we'll also reinstall the crank onto the axle on the other side. I have the locomotive upside down again. I've fitted the cranks back onto the rear axle, and I've reinstalled the screws that hold the cranks in place. I have the sprocket loosely on the axle. The Slo-mo's between the frames, 2 front clamp plates and 2 rear clamp plates held in place by 1 bolt in each one, but they're not tight yet. With the bolts done up and the clamp plates tight on the Slo-mo, they still don't lock onto the locomotive chassis. The Slo-mo will always be free to float between the frames. We're trying to get the large sprocket that we fitted to the axle nicely in line with the small sprocket in the Slo-mo to give us a nice straight run of chain between the 2 sprockets. Example, that would be too far to the left, and that would be way too far to the right. So we need to find the position in the centre that gives us that best run of chain. And I'm thinking for now that looks pretty good. We'll nip that grub screw up. Now I'm going to position the Slo-mo fore and aft and tighten up the clamp bolts. We want the Slo-mo in a position that gives us the best performance from the drive chain. If it's too tight, the loco will stall and it'll be difficult to accelerate smoothly from a standstill. If the chain is too loose, the loco will shudder when you're trying to run dead slow, such as shunting. We want to pull the Slo-mo forward and push the rear clamp plate back while we do up the bolt. I guess with this kind of action, I pull the Slo-mo forward, I push the clamp plate back, and I do up the bolt. Then we'll repeat that on the other side. I'll pull the Slo-mo forward, push the clamp plate back, and do up the bolt. That looks pretty good, maybe a touch loose. We'll try and get a better look at that. So here we have the chain, the Slo-mo adjusted and the bolts tightened. By putting a small screwdriver or an Allen key under that chain and lifting it, there should be a little bit of looseness or slack in the chain, a little bit of a joggle. It's worth rotating the rear axle through 1 full turn, because that joggle or slack in the chain will vary slightly. That's caused by slight variations in the pitch of the chain. It can also be caused by run out in the sprocket. Run out in a sprocket is when the sprocket isn't centrally located on the axle. It can be caused by a mismatch in the bore on the sprocket to the diameter of the axle, or imperfections on the axle. So we're trying to get to the point where at its tightest that chain still has a small amount of play. This may be something you won't get right until you've tried a few times. Give it a bit of a test run, then readjust it slightly. Remember, if the chain is too tight, the engine will stall, especially if the engine does stall with the main cranks in the same position each time. That's a pretty good indicator that at that point the chain is too tight. And if you go the other way and the chain's too loose, you will see shuddering when you're trying to run dead slow. But I'd give that a test run and maybe adjust it again 2 or 3 times over the next few runs until I get it just right. So the last part of the installation is to fit the cover. The cover doesn't give the Slo-mo any strength. It's not there to protect the gear train. It's just a visual thing. Because the boiler on billy locomotive is quite high above the frames, the Slo-mo is fairly obvious to sight, so the cover just makes it less obvious. The cover can't be fitted to the Slo-mo before it's installed because the cover has to go above the expansion link bushes, so we have to fit it after the Slo-mo is in place. I find it easy to undo the screw on the front boiler band and just move that boiler band around, give ourselves a little bit more room underneath. On the old style cover, the folded edge on one side is smaller than the folded edge on the other. If that's the case, put the smallest of the edges toward the back of the loco. I use a screwdriver or an Allen key on the other side of the loco just to support the front corner of the other side as I put it into the engine. So with that screwdriver on the other side to support the front corner, slide the Slo-mo cover in under the boiler, and once it's sitting in there flat, push it backward until the folded edge on the back of the cover engages in the clips on the back of the Slo-mo. To do that, you'll need to hold the front of the cover up. Then once the back edge is engaged on the clips, push the front edge down so it engages on the front of the Slo-mo. Then we have only to replace the parts on the locomotive that were removed. The dome for the safety valve, the sanding box, the lever, and then it's time to give it a test run.